The government today has released its religious discrimination bill. It's done so after 2 years of the Liberal Party arguing amongst themselves, and their divisions on this topic are still on full display today. Labor has not been consulted about this bill. It's apparent from some of the public reaction already that very many other Australians have not been consulted. Almost no religious organisations have been consulted. Certainly LGBTI groups do not appear to have been consulted. It's vital that the government allow a proper time for the whole Australian community to consider this religious discrimination bill. It's vital because this is a very important topic. It's one which, as I've said, the government has been arguing among themselves for more than 2 years. It's time that the debate that the government's been having internally be allowed to occur with the whole Australian community. And I'd call on the government to make sure that this is not a consultation in name only, but is a proper consultation, one where the government not only allows adequate time for people to express their views about this important bill, but listens to the views when they are expressed. Because one of the aspects to the way in which the government has been having this debate internally, and I think at one point the Attorney-General described it as workshops with Liberal backbenchers, is that they've been prepared to drop out hints to the community. They've been prepared to hint that they were going to do certain things, but never been prepared to have a full debate. What's now called for is the full debate and consultation that the Ruddock Review itself, the eminent panel that comprised the Ruddock Review, called for, saying that the government should ensure that there is a full debate on these issues if and when the government got to acting on, as it now has, the Ruddock Review. And of course it's the case that only some of the recommendations of that Ruddock Review are being implemented. Others the government apparently disagrees with.
Christian Porter's made it clear that there needs to be bipartisan support on this bill in order for it to pass. Where do you perceive the holes to be?
I've just seen this bill for the very first time. I'd say again, the government has chosen not to consult with the Australian Labor Party before releasing the exposure draft of this bill. Unlike the government, which has been having only an internal debate, Labor will be listening carefully to the whole Australian community. Labor will be consulting deeply and widely, which is what the government should be doing too.
Are you more disposed towards the bill considering it's mirrored on other anti-discrimination legislation instead of a broader freedom of religion bill?
Well, the Ruddock Review, of course, recommended against that broader kind of legislation. I'm not going to comment on the individual provisions of the bill until we've had proper time to examine it in detail.
The bill explicitly overrides Tasmania's Anti-Discrimination Act. Are you supportive of that?
That's a surprising feature of this bill. I've seen that already in the commentary that's occurred since the bill was released. It's a surprising feature because Mr Porter ruled out interfering with state anti-discrimination laws, and apparently, I haven't examined the provision myself, but apparently what this bill does is to do just that. It does directly interfere with the Tasmanian anti-discrimination law. That's a demonstration of the degree of difficulty, of the complexity of this kind of legislation, and of course we'll be examining that and every other provision very closely.
LGBTQI groups have said the bill will hand a sword to people of faith to attack minority groups. What's your response to those concerns? Do you really think that there is that kind of risk and danger to those minority groups?
Again, I'm not going to comment on the individual provisions of the bill until I've had a chance to closely examine them. And that means sit down and take some time by looking at them. It's a lengthy bill. It's one on which I'd want to be hearing from all groups in the community before I express a view or before Labor comes to a concluded view. But clearly that issue of whether or not there should be legislation in this area that provides, as has been put, a sword and not a shield is right at the heart of the way in which the Commonwealth Parliament should choose to legislate. It's related to, I'm reminded, another matter that the Attorney-General will have to clear up. He hasn't done so today, and that is how does this bill interact with the process that the government itself commenced by referring directly related matters to the Australian Law Reform Commission some time back. That review by the Australian Law Reform Commission of exemptions in the Sex Discrimination Act relating to religious institutions is ongoing. The Australian Law Reform Commission is about to publish, they've said, a discussion paper and are not due to report on the subject of their reference until sometime in 2020. The Attorney-General will need to explain more than he has today how the bill interacts with that process that's being conducted by the Law Reform Commission.
Should the government wait on this Discrimination Act until the Law Reform Commission has finished its report next year?
Well, this is a government without a plan on most things, and we're seeing them stumbling around in this area as well. It's for the Attorney-General to explain, because it's his reference to the Law Reform Commission that is potentially being interfered with here by the publication and production of this bill.
Mr Dreyfus, does Labor agree with the Prime Minister's decision to deport this Iraqi refugee who's been convicted of child sex offences?
The crimes of which this man was convicted are appalling crimes, and Australian law is very clear. There is no place for someone who has committed these crimes in Australia.
What's your response to the Prime Minister's observation that he came into Australia, came here during the chaos of the Labor years?
Well, the Prime Minister seems to be implying that immigration ministers have to foresee the future. And if he is saying that, then he needs to be considering whether he's accepting responsibility for every single one of the thousands of arrivals in Australia who he, as Immigration Minister, issued a visa to. Many, many thousands of people are in Australia, sitting here on a visa issued by Mr Morrison personally as Immigration Minister. Is he accepting responsibility for all of their conduct and all of their behaviour for so long as they remain in Australia?
Do people have a right to question whether background checks were sufficient enough?
I'd say again, these were abominable crimes committed by this man, and Australian law is clear. There is no place for this man in Australia.
Just on another issue, do you think it was appropriate for Mike Pizzullo to have called the Deputy Commissioner of the AFP on the night Annika Smethurst's home was raided to congratulate his officers on the raid?
I haven't seen those reports. If that's so, it's something I'll certainly be very interested in hearing more details about.
Can I ask you, sorry, just further on this question of the refugee, if he's been granted refugee status on the basis that he faces discrimination or torture or whatever in his own country, is it legal for Australia to return him to that country under our obligations in the UN Covenant?
These are terrible crimes that were committed by this man. Australian law is clear, and there is no place in Australia for this man.
But I mean, the question is, are we within our rights to send him back to Iraq or to send him somewhere else?
That's what Australian law presently says, and Australian law will work so as to remove this man from Australia.
Mr. Dreyfus, there's been some speculation about your future in the media over recent weeks. Are you committed to serving out this term in Parliament, and are you interested in a legal appointment by the Supreme Court?
I'm absolutely committed to serving out this term of Parliament, and that's the end of the matter. And I don't know where those ridiculous suggestions come from.
On the religious freedoms, do you believe that we would see this legislation passed by the end of the year, or is that unlikely?
I've said, and Labor's said repeatedly throughout the government's divisions and disputing and argumentation about this, that it's not good enough for the Liberal Party of Australia to keep this internal to the Liberal Party room. This is a matter which concerns all Australians. The whole community should have time and an appropriate opportunity to have a say on the proposals that finally have seen the light of day from the government. There needs to be appropriate time for consideration without even having yet looked at the bill in detail. I don't know exactly how long appropriate time is, but I would say it has to be a pretty decent amount of time, particularly when the Liberal Party of Australia has taken more than 2 years of arguing among themselves to get to where they've got to today.
So you're saying you're not going to rush this? Labor's not going to rush this just to see...
Well, the government is in charge of the process. It's for the government to decide...
But they want your support.
It's for the government to decide how long they're going to allow for consultation, and it's for the government to decide when they're going to bring this bill to the Parliament in a formal way. I would urge on the government that they allow appropriate time for this to be considered by all Australians allow appropriate time for debate and not rush it.
Okay, let's go. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
All right, the Shadow Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus there, reflecting on a couple of things, but principally the religious discrimination bill that Christian Porter, the Attorney-General, has released in a draft form today. His main concern is making sure there's enough time for consultation here, worried that there has not been, that there's been a lot of internal talk in the Liberal Party, but not with the stakeholder groups, the churches, and certainly not with Labor. But as to the substance of what's actually in this bill, well, clearly Mark Dreyfus wants to have a closer look at that. Touch of concern there that this could overwrite state anti-discrimination laws. Anyway, we'll talk more with Christian Porter, the Attorney-General, coming up at 4 o'clock in just over an hour from now, Australian Eastern Standard Time. Meanwhile, Israel Folau, who in many ways has been the case cited by many in this whole debate about religious freedom and religious discrimination. The former Wallaby star has now widened his case against Rugby Australia, claiming his sacking has prevented him from playing international football. Folau's lodged a statement with the federal court, arguing the move was an unreasonable restraint of trade. He also believes his contract did not prevent him from practising his religion or sharing his beliefs in his own time. The rugby player was let go after refusing to remove a controversial social media post. He's seeking an apology, financial compensation and the right to continue playing.